The signal hit the Arden Mule's passive array at 3:47 local, and Cade Morrow almost missed it because he was elbow-deep in the number 3 cargo clamp, trying to free a hydraulic cylinder that had seized during the last loading cycle. He heard the console chime from 30 meters down the spine corridor, faint over the hiss of pneumatic tools, and his first thought was debris proximity alert. The Arden Mule was a Type 9 heavy cargo hauler running a solo transit through the Palav Shoals, a stretch of interstellar space that the Shipping Guild classified as low traffic, low interest, and moderately littered with metallic junk from a mining consortium that had pulled out of the region 40 years ago. Proximity alerts were common. Cade had silenced 9 of them in the past 6 hours. He pulled his arm out of the clamp housing, wiped hydraulic fluid on his coveralls, and walked forward to the bridge. The bridge of a Type 9 was not a bridge in any military sense. It was a compartment roughly the size of a shipping container, with a pilot seat, a navigation console, a communications panel, and a coffee maker that Cade had installed himself because the manufacturer hadn't considered caffeine a structural necessity. The forward viewport was a reinforced slab of optically flat glass that showed nothing but stars and the faint amber smear of a nebula 200 light-years to port. The chime was not a proximity alert. The communications panel was flashing a pattern Cade had seen only twice in 11 years of solo hauling, and both times it had been a drill transmitted by fleet signal to verify that civilian vessels still had functional emergency receivers. Emergency intercept, unscheduled, not a drill. He sat down in the pilot's seat and pulled the signal log. The Arden Mule's comms array was a civilian unit rated for standard traffic, hails, docking requests, guild dispatches, weather advisories for atmospheric approaches. It was not designed to intercept military or diplomatic communications, but it had a passive listening mode mandated by interstellar maritime law, and that mode monitored a broad spectrum of emergency frequencies, including several that overlapped with non-human bands. The overlap was intentional. The convention had been negotiated 60 years ago at the Brannock Accords, and its purpose was simple. If anyone, anywhere, broadcast a distress signal that matched certain structural parameters, any ship with a functioning receiver would hear it. What the Arden Mule's receiver had caught was not directed at Cade. It was not directed at any human vessel. The signal's primary beam was aimed at a coalition relay station roughly 90 light-years coreward, a Dorvathy military installation called Anchor Point Tessel, which served as the emergency coordination hub for the Dorvathy Coalition's 7th Patrol Zone. The signal was compressed, encrypted with Dorvathy military-grade cipher protocols, and formatted in a packet structure that Cade's system couldn't fully decode. But the side lobe had bled. Every directional transmission had a side lobe, a faint, unintended leakage of energy radiating outward from the primary beam at oblique angles. In most cases, the side lobe was so weak that it dissipated into background noise within a few light minutes. But this signal was powerful. Whoever had sent it had pushed their transmitter to maximum output, and the side lobe had punched through the noise floor of the Palav Shoals and hit the Arden Mule's passive array with enough power to trigger the emergency intercept protocol. Cade's system couldn't decrypt the Dorvathy cipher, but it didn't need to. The structural parameters of the signal, its cadence, its repetition interval, its frequency allocation pattern, matched the universal distress profile defined by the Brannock Accords. The system had flagged it automatically. Someone was calling for help. They were calling the Dorvathy Coalition, not any human, and they were calling from a position that Cade's navigation computer placed at roughly 4 hours away at the Arden Mule's maximum transit speed. He pulled up the navigation plot. The signal origin was a system designated PV-4418 in the human catalog, which was not a system Cade had ever visited, ever planned to visit, or had any reason to know existed. The Shipping Guild route he was currently running took him through the shoals on a straight line from Kessler Station to Port Aveline, a transit of approximately 60 hours that he had done 41 times. PV 4418 was off the route by a margin that would cost him roughly 8 hours of deviation. 8 hours of deviation meant arriving at Port Aveline late. Late arrival meant a docking penalty. A docking penalty on a Type 9 hauler carrying 400 tons of industrial composites meant Cade would eat the cost out of his margin, which was already thin enough that he'd been considering whether to defer maintenance on the No. 3 clamp rather than pay for a proper rebuild. He stared at the signal log. The distress pattern repeated every 45 seconds, steady and automated, which meant it was probably a beacon rather than a live operator. A beacon meant a ship or station in trouble, broadcasting continuously until help arrived or the power died. Cade opened the Ardent Mule's communication log and composed a standard intercept report for fleet signals, documenting the time, position, signal characteristics, and apparent origin. He transmitted the report via burst relay to the nearest human communications node, which was marker 2261 Delta, an automated relay buoy roughly 12 light-years behind him. The report would reach fleet signals within a few hours. Fleet would assess, verify, and decide whether to dispatch a response. That was the protocol. File the report, continue your transit, let the professionals handle it. Cade looked at the navigation plot again. 4 hours to PV 4418 at maximum speed. 4 hours back. 8 hours of docking penalty. He didn't know what was at PV 4418. He didn't know who had sent the signal. He didn't know if they were Dorvathy or some other coalition species or something else entirely. He didn't know if the Dorvathy 7th Patrol had already received the primary beam and was already en route. He checked the Dorvathy 7th Patrol's published response time for this sector. The information was publicly available in the Coalition's Interstellar Traffic Database, which the Shipping Guild required all pilots to carry for route planning. The 7th Patrol maintained a presence at Anchor Point Test Cell, 90 light-years coreward. Standard response time for a Priority 1 distress signal, 18 to 22 hours, depending on patrol disposition. 18 hours at minimum. The signal had been broadcasting for Cade checked the timestamp, 47 minutes. He didn't know what was happening at PV 4418. He didn't know if whoever was there had 18 hours to wait. He ran one more check. The Ardent Mule's external hull sensors confirmed what the passive array had told him. There were no other ships in the system. No Coalition patrol. No commercial traffic. No one. PV 4418 was empty space with a colony that the wider galaxy apparently considered too small and too remote to warrant a permanent presence. Cade Morrow had been a cargo hauler for 11 years. Before that, he'd served 6 years in the Merchant Marine Auxiliary, running supply convoys along the colonial frontier. Before that, he'd been a deckhand on a fishing trawler in the Kuiper settlements, where the rule was simple. If you hear a distress call, you go. You don't calculate your margin. You don't check whether the call is meant for you. You don't wait for someone with a better ship or a bigger crew or a mandate to respond. You go because the next time the call goes out, it might be yours, and you want to live in a universe where someone answers. He knew what it felt like to be alone in a place where nobody was coming. He had lived it once, years ago, when a drive failure had left him drifting in the outer Valen Reach for 19 days before a passing survey ship spotted his emergency strobe. 19 days of rationing water, eating emergency concentrates that tasted like compressed cardboard, and talking to the ship systems because there was no one else to talk to. He had been found. He had been lucky. He had sworn afterward that he would never pass a distress call if he could help it, because 19 days of silence had taught him exactly how long forever could feel. He sat in the pilot's seat for another 30 seconds. He thought about his ex-wife, who had left him 4 years ago because, she said, he treated the ship like it mattered more than people, and who had been wrong about that in a way she would never know. He thought about the deckhand next to him on the Kuiper trawler who had pulled a drowning fisherman out of the ammonia ice slurry on Triton Station and gotten chemical burns on both arms and never once suggested he should have stayed dry. He thought about the 19 days adrift. He entered the course correction into the navigation computer. The Arden Mule's transit drive hummed as it recalculated, and the stars in the viewport shifted by a fraction of a degree. The navigation computer displayed the deviation cost in flat, unsentimental numbers. Additional transit time, 7.8 hours. Fuel expenditure, 12% of reserve. Estimated docking penalty at Port Avalon, 3,000 credits. Estimated client complaint for late delivery, probable. Estimated impact on Shipping Guild reliability rating, negative degree uncertain. Cade acknowledged the advisory and dismissed it. The advisory had no field for the number of people at the other end of the signal. The Shipping Guild's cost-benefit algorithms did not account for the possibility that the operator might hear a voice in the static and recognize it as his own, the voice of someone alone, calling out, waiting for the silence to break. 4 hours. He went back to the number 3 clamp and finished freeing the hydraulic cylinder, because whatever he found at PV 4418, he wanted all 6 clamps operational. He also ran a diagnostic on the portable welding unit, replaced the gas cartridge on the cutting torch, and loaded 2 extra drums of structural adhesive onto the motorized cargo pallet. He didn't know what he'd find. He prepared for what he could carry. The Arden Mule dropped out of transit at the edge of the PV 4418 system 3 hours and 48 minutes later, 12 minutes ahead of the navigation computer's estimate, because Cade had pushed the transit drive past its rated output and would probably need to replace 2 regulator coils at Port Avalon. The system was unremarkable: a yellow-white main sequence star, 4 rocky inner planets, 2 gas giants in the outer system, an asteroid belt, no registered colonies, stations, or installations in the human catalog. The distress beacon was broadcasting from the second planet. Cade brought the Arden Mule in on a cautious approach, passive sensors only, and built a picture of what was happening below. The second planet was a rocky world with a thin atmosphere, breathable for Dorvathy, according to the atmospheric data the beacon was transmitting in its unencrypted header. The surface was arid, mostly desert, with scattered geological formations that suggested ancient water erosion. There was no orbital infrastructure, no satellites, no relay stations. What there was on the planet's surface was a colony. Not a military installation, not a research station, a colony civilian. The beacon's unencrypted metadata, the portion that the Brannock Accords required to be transmitted in plaintext alongside the encrypted main packet, listed a population of 4,209 individuals. Species, Rithani. Affiliation, Dorvathy Coalition, 7th Administrative Province. Colony designation, Varath Settlement. Cade had never heard of the Rithani. The Arden Mule's database had a sparse entry: a coalition member species, bipedal, oxygen-breathing, roughly human-sized, classified as non-spacefaring in their own right and dependent on coalition infrastructure for interstellar transport and communications. They were, as far as the database was concerned, an unremarkable client species of the Dorvathy Coalition, one of dozens. The beacon's metadata also contained the reason for the distress signal, and when Cade read it, he understood why the transmitter had been pushed to maximum output. The colony's primary water processor had suffered a catastrophic failure 6 hours ago. The processor was the only source of potable water for the settlement. The planet's surface water was contaminated with mineral concentrations that were toxic to Rithani biology. Without the processor, the colony had approximately 72 hours of stored water reserves at rationing levels. That was the simple problem. The compound problem was worse. The water processor failure had been caused by a seismic event, a geological tremor that had damaged the processor's foundation and ruptured 3 of its 4 filtration stages. The same tremor had collapsed a section of the colony's underground storage complex, trapping an unspecified number of colonists in the lower levels. The same tremor had damaged the colony's landing platform, rendering it unable to receive large transport vessels. And the same tremor had knocked out the colony's primary communications array, forcing them to broadcast the distress signal on a backup transmitter that was old, poorly maintained, and aimed approximately, but not precisely, at Anchor Point Tessel. That imprecise aim was why the side lobe had been strong enough to reach the Palav Shoals. The backup transmitter's directional focus was sloppy, scattering energy across a wide cone rather than a tight beam. Most of that scattered energy was wasted. A thin sliver of it had found the Arden Mule. Cade read the metadata twice. 72 hours of water, trapped colonists, damaged landing platform. And the Dorvathy 7th Patrol, the intended recipient of this signal, was at minimum 18 hours away even if they had received the primary beam at Anchor Point Tessel. Had they received it? Cade couldn't know. The backup transmitter's sloppy aim meant the primary beam might have reached Tessel, or it might have missed by enough to fall below the relay station's detection threshold. There was no way to verify from here. 4,209 people, waiting for help that might or might not be coming, from a species that might or might not have heard them. Cade opened the Arden Mule's cargo manifest. 400 tons of industrial composites consigned to a construction firm at Port Aveline, high-density polymer sheets, structural adhesive in 200-liter drums, reinforcement mesh, thermal insulation panels, fasteners by the crate, sealant compounds, pressure-rated conduit. Construction materials, the kind of materials you would use to build things or repair them. He checked the Arden Mule's equipment locker. 2 cutting torches, a portable welding unit, 3 sets of heavy-lift rigging, a geological survey kit that he carried because the shipping guild offered a bonus for mineral assay data from uncharted systems, a portable atmospheric analyzer, 200 meters of synthetic cable rated to 12 tons, a first aid kit designed for human physiology but containing broad-spectrum antibiotics that had some documented cross-species efficacy. He checked the Arden Mule's water reserves. The hauler carried a standard complement for a solo operator on a 60-hour transit, 400 liters in the main tank, plus 50 liters in the emergency reserve. Far more than one person needed. Not enough to supply 4,000, but enough to buy time. Cade sat in the pilot's seat and looked at the planet below. He thought about docking penalties. He thought about regulator coils. He thought about the number 3 clamp, which still wasn't right and would probably need professional attention. Then he stopped thinking about those things. He keyed the communications panel and broadcast on the Brannock Accord's universal hail frequency, plain text, unencrypted, aimed at the planet's surface. Verath Settlement, this is the cargo vessel Arden Mule Human Registry Independent Operator. I have intercepted your distress signal. I am not Coalition. I am not your intended recipient. I am a cargo hauler carrying construction materials. I am inbound to your position. Estimated arrival at low orbit, 35 minutes. Please advise on your landing platform status and any immediate requirements. Morrow out. He didn't wait for a response before beginning the orbital insertion burn. The response came 14 minutes later, while the Arden Mule was decelerating into a low polar orbit over the colony site. The voice was female, speaking accented standard trade, the lingua franca used for interspecies commerce in this region, and she sounded like someone who had been shouting for 6 hours and had nothing left but the words. Cargo vessel Arden Mule, this is Settlement Director Neve Sarath, Verath Colony. We do not understand your transmission. You are not Coalition. How did you receive our signal? Cade adjusted the gain on his microphone. Director Sareth, your backup transmitter has a wide side lobe spread. I caught the bleed on my passive array while transiting the Palav Shoals, roughly 4 light towers from your position. Your primary beam was aimed at Anchor Point Tessel. I don't know if it reached. A pause. When she spoke again, her voice was very controlled. You are telling me that you, a single cargo vessel, intercepted a signal that was not intended for you, deviated from your route and came here. That's correct. Why? Cade thought about the question. There were several possible answers, most of them more articulate than the truth. He chose the truth. Because I heard you. Another pause, longer this time. In the background, Cade could hear other voices, rapid, urgent, speaking what he assumed was the Rithani native language. Then Sareth was back. Arden Mule, our landing platform is partially collapsed. The main pad can support a vessel up to 40 tons. Your vessel is 1,200 tons loaded, I know. I'm not going to land on your pad. Cade was already pulling up the geological survey data his sensors were collecting during the orbital pass. I'm looking at a flat basin approximately 3 kilometers northeast of your settlement. Hard-packed sedimentary surface. I can put the mule down there if the ground holds. That is the Tesserath Basin. It is, I believe it is solid ground, yes, but 3 kilometers. I have a surface vehicle in my cargo bay, industrial mover, short range, but it'll carry material. He didn't have a surface vehicle. He had a motorized cargo pallet, which was technically a surface vehicle in the same way that a wheelbarrow was technically a transportation system. It would work. Director Sareth, we also have wounded to discuss and power grid damage, but first, talk to me about your water processor. What specifically failed? There was a long silence on the channel. Cade could hear Sareth breathing. He could hear other voices behind her, rapid and urgent, and one voice that sounded like it was reading numbers, pressure readings, or structural data, or the water reserve count ticking down. Arden Mule, Sareth said finally. We have 11 people with injuries from the tremor. Our medical facility is operational but understaffed. 1 physician, 2 medics, 4,000 people. And the tremor damaged our power distribution grid. Several residential sectors have lost heating. The overnight surface temperature drops below freezing. The Rithani do not tolerate sustained cold well. Cade thought about the thermal insulation panels in his cargo. They were designed for building construction, wall insulation, roof panels, floor barriers. They weren't emergency blankets, but they could be cut and distributed to provide thermal protection. Director, I carry thermal insulation panels, industrial grade. Your people can cut them to size for emergency heating barriers, but the water is first priority. Tell me about the processor. The next 6 minutes were a technical briefing, delivered by a woman who was clearly not an engineer, but who had been standing next to engineers for 6 hours, and had absorbed enough to relay the essentials. The processor's primary filtration assembly had cracked when the foundation shifted during the tremor. 3 of 4 stages were breached. The 4th stage was intact but couldn't operate alone. It needed the upstream stages to pre-filter the raw water, which carried heavy concentrations of cadmium sulfate and arsenic compounds. Without pre-filtration, the raw water would poison anyone who drank it within days. Cade listened, cross-referencing against his cargo manifest. Polymer sheets could be cut and formed into temporary filtration housings. Structural adhesive could seal cracks in the existing stages if the damage was accessible. Reinforcement mesh could stabilize a cracked foundation if bolted into the surrounding rock. Sealant compound could patch breached filtration membranes as a stopgap. None of this was proper repair. It was field improvisation of the crudest kind, using construction materials for a purpose they were never designed for. It might work for a few days. It might not work at all. But a few days was the difference between 72 hours of water and enough time for the Dorvathy 7th Patrol to arrive, if they had received the signal. And if they hadn't, it was enough time for Cade's intercept report to reach fleet signals, and for someone with actual resources to respond. He had done this before. Not this exactly. Not patching alien water processors on a planet he'd never heard of for a species he'd never met, but the underlying calculus. On the colonial frontier, things broke constantly and the nearest replacement part was weeks away. You learned to look at what you had, look at what was broken, and build a bridge between the two using stubbornness and whatever was in your cargo hold. The Merchant Marine Auxiliary had a name for it: adequate response. Not perfect, not elegant, not permanent, just enough to keep the situation from getting worse until the real help arrived. The trick was knowing the difference between an adequate response and a dangerous one. An adequate response was a polymer patch over a cracked filtration housing, held with mechanical fasteners and backed by an adhesive gasket. It would leak, it would degrade, and it would need to be replaced within days, but it would hold. A dangerous response was pretending the patch would hold indefinitely, or pushing it past its tolerance, or failing to monitor it because you were too tired or too confident. The line between adequate and dangerous was thin, and it moved depending on how desperate you were. Cade was not desperate yet. He had tools, materials, and time, not much time, but enough. 4 hours to get there. Maybe 70 hours of water left when he arrived. A few hours to assess, plan, and execute. That was a workable timeline. Tight, but workable. Director Soreth, I'm beginning descent. I need you to have someone who knows your processor standing by when I arrive. Someone who can show me the damage and tell me what tolerances I'm working with. I carry polymer, adhesive, mesh, sealant. I'm not an engineer, but I've rebuilt a lot of things that weren't supposed to be rebuilt. Arden Mule, her voice caught. She stopped, composed herself, and when she spoke again the control was back but fragile. Arden Mule, you understand that we did not call you. I understand that, Director. You understand that you have no obligation to us. We have no treaty with your species, no commerce agreement, no diplomatic contact of any kind. I understand that too. Then why are you coming? Because you have 4,000 people with 72 hours of water and a landing pad that can't receive a proper rescue ship, he said. And I have 400 tons of construction material, a welding unit, and no good reason not to be here. He cut the connection and began the descent sequence. The descent was rough. PV-4418II's thin atmosphere meant less drag but also less aerodynamic feedback, and the Arden Mule handled like a brick on a good day. Cade fought the attitude thrusters through a crosswind shear at 12,000 meters that tried to roll the ship 15 degrees, corrected manually, because the autopilot's atmospheric profile for this planet was non-existent, and brought the hauler into a final approach that his flight recorder would later flag as outside nominal parameters. At 3,000 meters, the surface resolved into detail. He could see the settlement, a grid of low structures clustered around a central plaza, with agricultural plots extending outward in concentric rings. The damage was visible even from altitude. A collapsed section of the eastern perimeter where the underground storage complex had caved, a twisted antenna mast that had been the primary communications array, and a landing platform with one corner buckled downward like a bent playing card. Smoke or steam rose from somewhere near the eastern buildings, the water processor probably venting through ruptured seals. He could also see people, small figures moving between buildings, carrying things, gathering in clusters. 4,000 of them, give or take, all of them awake at what would have been their middle of the night, all of them knowing that their water was running out and their call for help had gone into the dark, and they didn't know if anyone had heard it. Someone had heard it, someone who wasn't supposed to. He set the mule down in the Tesseract Basin, with the kind of gentle precision that only comes from putting heavy ships on surfaces that weren't meant for heavy ships, running the strut pressure monitors until all 6 showed green, then shutting down the transit drive and opening the aft cargo ramp. The air outside was thin and dry, warmer than he expected. The oxygen content was lower than standard human tolerance, not dangerous, but he could feel it in the slight shallowness of his breathing, and the faint buzz behind his temples that meant his body was working harder to oxygenate. PV-4418II had a surface gravity of 0.83 standard, which made the 400-ton cargo feel lighter, but also made Cade's inner ear slightly unreliable. He climbed down the ramp carrying his welding unit, his cutting torch, and a portable work light, and found a delegation waiting for him in the basin. There were 6 of them, 5 Rithani and 1 who Cade identified by uniform as Dorvathi, taller, broader, with the angular facial structure and mottled gray-green skin that matched the sparse images in his database. The Rithani were smaller, compactly built, with smooth russet-brown skin and wide dark eyes that caught the late afternoon light. They wore civilian clothes, work jumpsuits, thermal wraps, boots caked with dust. They looked exhausted. The Dorvathi stepped forward. He wore a coalition military uniform, rank insignia on the collar, sidearm on his hip. His expression was precisely the look of someone who had expected rescue ships and gotten a cargo hauler. "I am Subcommander Darren Koss, Coalition Military Liaison, Varath Settlement." He spoke standard trade with the clipped precision of a career officer. "You are the human from the cargo vessel." "Cade Morrow, independent hauler." Cade set the welding unit down and extended his hand. Koss looked at the hand, looked at Cade and did not take it. "Mr. Morrow, our distress signal was directed to Anchor Point Tessel. The Dorvathi 7th Patrol is the designated response authority for this sector. You have no jurisdiction, no mandate, and no formal standing to conduct operations in Coalition space." Cade let his hand drop. "Subcommander, I didn't come here on jurisdiction. I came because your backup transmitter bled a side lobe into the Palav Shoals and my receiver picked it up. I filed an intercept report with my own fleet signals before I deviated. That report is in the system. When it reaches a crude station, someone with actual resources will respond. In the meantime, I have construction materials that might let us patch your water processor enough to buy time. The 7th Patrol is 18 hours away if they received your signal at Tessel, 22 if they didn't receive it immediately and had to wait for a relay confirmation. Your people have 72 hours of stored water. That math gives you a margin, but not much of one if anything goes wrong." Koss's jaw tightened. One of the Rithani, a woman in a dusty work jumpsuit with tool loops on her belt, stepped forward. "I am Chief Processor Technician Merritt Vane. I maintain the water systems." She looked at the Arden mule behind Cade, then back at him. "You said you carry polymer sheeting and sealant compounds. 400 tons of construction materials. Tell me what's broken and I'll tell you what I can do." Vane didn't look at Koss. She looked at Cade, and in her wide dark eyes he saw the calculation, protocol versus water. The calculation took her about half a second. "Follow me." The water processor was housed in a reinforced structure at the settlement's eastern edge, built half into the bedrock to take advantage of the natural aquifer below. The tremor had cracked the foundation along a diagonal line that ran from the northwest corner to the southeast, displacing one side by nearly 30 centimeters and shearing the connection points between filtration stages 2 and 3. Stage 1, the coarse pre-filter, had survived with minor damage. Stage 2 was cracked along its full length, leaking raw water into the processing chamber. Stage 3 was worse. The housing had buckled, deforming the internal membrane assembly beyond its tolerance. Stage 4 was intact but isolated, useless without input from the upstream stages. Vane walked him through it in 15 minutes, pointing out each failure point with the practiced calm of someone who had already done her crying, and was now operating on professional discipline alone. Cade listened, took measurements, asked questions about material tolerances and operating pressures, and built a plan in his head. It was not a good plan, it was the only plan. Stage 2, he said, kneeling beside the cracked housing. The crack is structural, but the membrane assembly inside is intact. If I cut polymer sheet to match the exterior profile and bond it over the crack with structural adhesive, then reinforce the joint with mesh bolted through the existing housing flange, you'll get a sealed chamber. It won't hold rated pressure, maybe 60%. Can your system run at 60% capacity? Vane calculated. At 60%, the flow rate through stage 4 will be roughly 1,500 liters per hour instead of the rated 4,000. It would take, at ration consumption for 4,000 people, approximately 4 days to process enough water to refill the reserve tanks. 4 days is inside the window. What about stage 3? Stage 3 is destroyed. The housing is buckled. The membranes are sheared. Cade looked at the buckled housing. It was a cylinder roughly 2 meters in diameter and 3 meters long, made of a ceramic composite material he didn't recognize. Building a replacement from polymer sheet was not possible. But what does stage 3 do exactly, in terms of filtration? It removes the cadmium sulfate and arsenic compounds. Stages 1 and 2 handle particulates and biological contaminants. Stage 3 handles the mineral toxins. Stage 4 is the final polish. It removes residual contamination and adjusts pH. So if we bypass stage 3 entirely and run water from stage 2 directly to stage 4, what comes out the other end? Water contaminated with cadmium sulfate at approximately 4 parts per million and arsenic at 0.8 parts per million. Toxic to Rithani at sustained consumption levels. Lethal within, she paused. I do not know the threshold for your species. Not my concern right now. Is there any way to reduce the mineral concentration before stage 4? Anything available in the colony? Vane thought. One of the other Rithani technicians, a young man who had been silent until now, spoke up. Precipitation, he said. If we can add a coagulant to the post-stage 2 flow and let it settle in a tank, the cadmium sulfate and arsenic will bind to the coagulant and precipitate out. It is crude, first-year chemistry, but it would reduce the concentration by perhaps 70%. What do you need for a coagulant? Aluminum compounds, ferric chloride, any, he stopped. We do not have those. Cade was already moving back toward the Arden mule. I have industrial structural adhesive, polymer-based, aluminum-loaded composite. If we dilute it, would the aluminum component work as a coagulant? Vane and the young technician exchanged a look. The kind of look that said this is insane, but the chemistry might be sound. Vane turned to the young technician. Dren, pull a sample container from the storage rack. We need raw aquifer water and a graduated dilution set. Dren moved without hesitation, already calculating ratios allowed in Rithani. Cade caught enough of the numbers to know the young man was sharp. He was working backward from the aluminum content listed on the adhesive drums, estimating the minimum concentration needed for effective flocculation, adjusting for temperature and the specific gravity of the local water. Subcommander Koss had followed them through the entire inspection without speaking. Now he spoke. Mr. Morrow, I must formally note that you are conducting unsanctioned repair operations on coalition civilian infrastructure, using non-certified materials from a foreign vessel, without authorization from the 7th Patrol Command. Cade, who was walking toward his ship to begin unloading polymer sheet, stopped and turned around. Subcommander, you can note whatever you need to note. I'll stand for whatever inquiry the coalition wants to hold after your people have water. But right now, those people in your underground storage complex, the ones trapped by the cave-in, how long have they been down there? Koss's expression shifted. Something behind the protocol cracked just for a moment. 7 hours. Do they have water? Unknown. The storage complex had a small reserve. If it survived the collapse. Air. Adequate. The ventilation shafts are geological, natural convection. Then they have air but maybe no water, and they've been down there 7 hours. Your patrol is at minimum 11 hours away. If they don't have water, that's 18 hours without it in a desert climate with thin atmosphere. How long can a Rithani go without water? Koss looked at him for a long moment. The military liaison in him was still composing the formal objection. The officer in him was doing different math. 40 hours, Koss said quietly. Under ideal conditions, less in heat, less under stress. Then we have time, but not a lot, and I need hands. How many people in this settlement know how to use tools? By the end of the first hour, Cade had 47 volunteers working under his direction, and the Arden Mule's cargo bay was half empty. The motorized cargo pallet made 3 trips from the basin to the settlement in that first hour, loaded with polymer sheet and adhesive drums and crates of fasteners. Cade drove it the first time, realized the terrain was rougher than the survey data suggested, loose scree over hardpan, with gullies where ancient water channels had carved shallow trenches, and flagged the worst sections with strips of thermal insulation so the Rithani drivers could avoid them on subsequent runs. One of the volunteers, an older man named Torin who had operated mining equipment before the colony transitioned to agriculture, took over the pallet duties and ran it with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood machines. He organized them into 3 teams. Team 1, led by Vane and her technicians, worked on the water processor. They cut polymer sheet to template using the measurements Cade had taken during the inspection, working on the flat ground outside the processor building because the interior space was too cramped for sheet fabrication. Vane directed the cutting with the precision of someone accustomed to working within tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, adjusting Cade's initial templates twice, where the curvature of the housing required compensation. The Rithani cutting tools were smaller than what Cade was used to, designed for hands with 4 shorter fingers and a different grip angle, but they were sharp and well-maintained, and the polymer cut cleanly. They bonded the cut sheets over the stage 2 crack with structural adhesive, applying it in 2 layers with a drying interval between them that Vane insisted on despite the time pressure, because she understood material science well enough to know that a single thick layer would cure unevenly and crack under thermal load. Then, they bolted reinforcement mesh through the housing flanges using fasteners from the mule's cargo. Cade welded the anchor points himself, lying on his back under the processor housing in a space barely wide enough for his shoulders, while a Rithani teenager held a worklight above him and a second passed tools. The teenager's name was Liz, and she was Vane's apprentice, and she held the worklight with the steady hands of someone who had been trained to assist in precision work, and understood that a wobbling light source was worse than no light at all. Team 2 worked on the bypass. They built a crude settling tank from polymer sheet, sealed with adhesive, positioned between stages 2 and 4. Dren mixed a dilute solution of structural adhesive in water and tested it on a sample of raw aquifer water. The aluminum compounds in the adhesive did, in fact, act as a coagulant. The cadmium sulfate precipitated out as a cloudy sediment. The arsenic reduction was less dramatic but measurable. It was ugly chemistry. It was the kind of chemistry that would make a proper water treatment engineer weep. But when Dren ran the filtered sample through a borrowed atmospheric analyzer recalibrated for liquid assay, the mineral concentrations were below the Rithani toxicity threshold. "It works," Dren said, looking at the readout with an expression that mixed relief with disbelief. Then more quietly to Vane, "The cadmium is at 1.1 parts per million, below the acute threshold by a factor of 3. The arsenic is at 0.2. We could drink this." Vane took the readout from his hands, read it twice, and handed it back. Run it again with a fresh sample. Different batch of raw water. Dren ran it again. The numbers held. A third time, Vane said. Chief Technician. A third time, Dren. He ran it a third time. The cadmium reading came back at 1.3, the arsenic at 0.25, still within tolerance. Vane stared at the numbers for a long moment, and Cade saw her hands trembling before she pressed them flat against the console surface. Scale it up, she said. Team 3 worked on the cave-in. The underground storage complex had collapsed at a junction point where a natural cavern met a constructed corridor. The debris was a mix of fractured rock and structural material, heavy, unstable, and dangerous to move without proper equipment. Cade didn't have proper equipment. He had synthetic cable rated to 12 tons, a cutting torch, and a motorized cargo pallet that he repurposed as a winch by anchoring it to a boulder and using the drive motor to pull cable. He directed the digging himself, because he had spent 2 years in the Merchant Marine Auxiliary clearing collapsed supply tunnels on the colonial frontier, and he knew what a false ceiling looked like before it came down on your head. The Rithani volunteers were willing but untrained, and Cade stopped them 3 times when they tried to pull debris from load-bearing positions. That one stays until we brace the arch, he told a Rithani man twice his age who was trying to drag a slab of rock out of the gap. If we pull it now, the lintel drops and we lose the opening. The man looked at the slab, looked at Cade, and stepped back. My daughter is down there. I know, we'll get to her, but not through a secondary collapse. The man, his name was Kelath, and he was a soil chemist in the colony's agricultural division, stayed. He worked alongside Cade for the next 2 hours, following instructions precisely, asking no questions that weren't operational, and speaking only when he heard his daughter's voice from the other side of the debris calling for him through the gaps in the rubble. I am here, Sareen, he called back each time, his voice steady in a way that Cade recognized from his own years in emergency response. The steadiness of a person who had decided that falling apart was something they would do later, after the work was done. The most dangerous section was a 3-ton slab of foundation stone that had wedged diagonally across the corridor, creating a bottleneck that nothing could pass through, and that couldn't be moved without destabilizing the ceiling above it. Cade studied it for 10 minutes, walking around it, tapping the surface with a bolt to listen to the resonance, checking the contact points where it pressed against the corridor walls. We don't move it, he said finally. We go under it. He cut a channel beneath the slab with the cutting torch, carving into the corridor floor, which was compacted rock, not constructed material, to create a crawl space roughly 60 centimeters high. The torch threw sparks that burned small holes in his coveralls. The heat in the enclosed space was brutal. 2 Rithani volunteers worked beside him, pulling the cut rock out of the channel and stacking it behind them. It took 40 minutes to cut a passage wide enough for a person to crawl through on their belly. Cade went through first, because if the slab shifted while someone was in the channel, he wanted it to be the person who understood the structural risk. The slab didn't shift. He emerged on the other side and found 31 people waiting in the storage complex, 9 children, 4 injured, all dehydrated but alive. They braced the arch with polymer sheet cut into load-bearing panels, wedged into the gaps and bonded with adhesive. It was not engineered. It was carpentry practiced at the scale of geology, and Cade knew it would hold for hours, not years, but hours were what they needed. They pulled everyone out. The man's daughter was the last one through. She was 8 years old, covered in rock dust, and she walked out of the tunnel on her own 2 feet, gripping a water container that she had apparently refused to drink from because, as she told her father in accented standard trade that Cade overheard, there were littler ones who needed it more. Cade looked away from the reunion between Kelath and his daughter because it wasn't his to watch, and went to check on the injured. He carried the one with the crushing injury himself, because the Rithani volunteers were smaller, and the terrain between the tunnel entrance and the colony's medical station was rough. He walked 400 meters with the man in a field carry across his shoulders, the same carry he'd learned in Merchant Marine Auxiliary training, and laid him on the treatment table in the colony's small medical facility, where a Rithani doctor named Sarath was already working on the others. The medical facility was a single room with 4 treatment tables, a sterilization unit, and a pharmaceutical cabinet that Sarath had organized with the precision of someone who knew she was the only physician for 4,000 people and could not afford to waste time searching for supplies. She was working on a child with a fractured wrist when Cade brought in the crushing injury, and she directed him to table 3 without breaking her focus. Sarath looked at the splint Cade had fashioned from a polymer offcut and synthetic cable. "This is crude," she said. "It's what I had. It is holding the fracture in adequate alignment. The circulation below the injury site is intact, which suggests you applied the binding with some understanding of vascular compression." She began removing the splint to apply her own treatment. "Where did you learn field medicine?" "Merchant Marine Auxiliary. We got 2 weeks of training. Most of it was about not making things worse." "An admirable philosophy, one that more practitioners could benefit from." She glanced up at him. "You are bleeding." Cade looked down. There was a gash on his left forearm, probably from the cutting torch work in the tunnel. He hadn't noticed. The thin atmosphere and the work had masked it. "It's a scratch." "It is a laceration approximately 8 centimeters in length, and it is contaminated with rock dust and what appears to be cutting torch residue. You will develop an infection if it is not cleaned. Sit." He sat. She cleaned and sealed the wound with a Rithani adhesive strip that bonded to his skin with a slight warming sensation. It took 90 seconds. "Your blood is a different color than ours," she observed, pressing the edges of the adhesive strip into place. "Red, iron-based, I assume. Ours is copper-based, blue-green." "Huh," Cade said. It was the most he could manage on the subject of comparative hematology at that moment. "I will need to examine you again in 4 hours. The adhesive may not be fully compatible with your epidermal chemistry. If it causes irritation, return immediately." "Yes, ma'am." "Do not call me ma'am. I am a physician, not a military officer. Doctor will suffice." Then he was back on his feet and heading for the water processor. At the 4-hour mark, the stage 2 patch blew. Not catastrophically, the polymer held, but the adhesive bond along the lower flange cracked under the thermal cycling of hot raw water flowing through cold desert-chilled housing, and a fine spray of unfiltered water began misting into the processing chamber. Vane shut the system down. Dren caught the spray on his arm and spent 3 minutes washing cadmium-laden water off his skin while cursing in Rithani. Cade crawled under the housing again. The failure point was visible, a 12-centimeter section where the adhesive had delaminated from the ceramic housing surface. The ceramic was smoother than the polymer, and the adhesive was designed for polymer-to-polymer bonding, not polymer to ceramic. He lay on his back looking at the gap and considered the problem. The adhesive wouldn't hold to the ceramic under thermal stress. He needed a mechanical bond, not a chemical one. "Vane, does your colony have any drilling equipment, even hand tools?" "We have geological survey drills, small ones for mineral sampling." "Get me 3. And some of those fasteners, the short ones." He drilled through the ceramic housing wall carefully, because cracking it further would end everything, and bolted the polymer patch directly to the housing with mechanical fasteners, bypassing the adhesive bond entirely. The drill bits were designed for rock sampling, not precision work, and 2 of them broke before he finished the 8 holes he needed. The 3rd bit held. He torqued the fasteners by hand, feeling for the point where the ceramic began to protest, and stopped just short of it. Then he resealed the edges with adhesive as a secondary barrier. not relying on it to hold, but letting it act as a gasket. Try it again, he told Vane. She restarted the system. The water flowed, the patch held, the spray didn't return. Pressure, Cade asked from under the housing. 52%, down from 60. Can you live with 52? We can live with 52. Hour 6. The sun was going down on PV 4418 II, and the temperature was dropping fast. The water processor was running. Not well. Not at rated capacity. Stage 2 was patched with polymer and mesh, sealed with enough adhesive to hold at 52% pressure, and feeding raw water through the improvised settling tank where Dren's crude coagulant was pulling cadmium sulfate out of solution. The water that emerged from Stage 4 was not pristine. It was cloudy, tasted of polymer, and had mineral concentrations that would concern a health inspector. It was drinkable. The Rithani could survive on it. Vane ran the first batch through a full analysis, checked the numbers twice, and authorized distribution. The settlement's water rationing team began filling containers from the Stage 4 output, and for the first time in 12 hours, Vareth Colony had a functioning, if barely, water supply. Cade was sitting on the ground outside the processor building, drinking from his own canteen and eating a ration bar, when Director Sareth found him. She was shorter than he'd expected from her voice, compact, with the same russet-brown skin and wide, dark eyes as the other Rithani, her face lined with exhaustion and authority. She sat down next to him on the hard ground without ceremony. "The 7th Patrol has acknowledged our signal," she said. "They received the primary beam at Tessel. A response detachment is en route. Estimated arrival, 14 hours. Cade nodded. "Good, they'll have proper equipment." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Morrow, your fleet signals has also responded to your intercept report. A message was relayed through your marker buoy. They are dispatching a humanitarian support vessel from, I believe the station is called Kessler." "Kessler Station. That's where I was coming from." "The support vessel will carry water purification equipment, medical supplies, and engineering personnel. Estimated arrival, 26 hours. Cade did the math. The Dorvathy Patrol in 14 hours to handle the military and structural assessment. A human support vessel in 26 hours with proper water purification and medical teams. Vane's improvised processor running in the meantime at 1,500 liters per hour, enough to keep the colony hydrated. The window held, barely and with no margin for error, but it held. "Director, I should tell you that I used approximately 60 tons of consigned cargo, polymer sheet, adhesive, mesh, and sealant, for the repairs. That material was contracted to a construction firm at Port Aveline. I'll have to account for it." Sareth looked at him. "You used your cargo, your paid cargo, material that someone else is expecting." "I did." "How much is it worth?" "Enough that I'll be explaining it to the shipping guild for a while." She didn't respond immediately. She looked at the processor building, where lights were on, and the sound of flowing water was audible through the walls. And then she looked at the tunnel opening where Team 3's volunteers were still working to stabilize the passage and recover supplies from the storage complex. And then she looked at the Arden Mule sitting in the basin 3 kilometers away, its cargo ramp still open, its running lights the only artificial illumination on this side of the settlement. "You came alone," she said. "I did." "One ship, one person. No mandate, no treaty, no obligation." "That's right." "And you came because, what was the phrase you used? Because you heard us." "That's what I said." Sareth was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice had lost the formal register entirely. She sounded tired and honest, and something else that Cade couldn't name. "Subcommander Koss has filed his formal objection to your presence and your operations. He is required to do so under coalition protocols. He has also, privately, and off the record, asked me to tell you that the 31 people recovered from the storage complex include his nephew. Cade said nothing. He wanted you to know that. He did not want to tell you himself because he is still composing the formal objection, and he feels that personal gratitude would compromise its integrity. Despite everything, Cade felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Tell the sub-commander his objection is noted, and I look forward to his inquiry with great interest. Zareth almost smiled, almost. I will tell him. She stood, brushed the dust from her trousers, and looked down at him. Mr. Morrow, when the 7th Patrol arrives, they will bring their own communications equipment. One of the first things I intend to do with that equipment is transmit a formal report to the Coalition Council regarding this incident. The report will document that our distress signal was intended for Anchor Point Tessel, that a human cargo vessel, operating alone in an adjacent sector, intercepted a sidelobe emission that was not directed at any human receiver, that the vessel's operator deviated from his commercial route at personal cost to respond to a signal from a species he had never encountered, and that the operator, using only the materials available on his cargo vessel, improvised repairs that preserved our water supply, extracted our trapped colonists, and bought the time we needed for the intended response to arrive. She paused. The report will also note that at no point did the operator request compensation, invoke any treaty or agreement, or condition his assistance on any reciprocal obligation. He simply came because he heard us. Cade looked up at her. The sky behind her was darkening, and the first stars were coming out, and somewhere out there, the Dorvathy 7th Patrol was burning toward this system as fast as its engines could push. Director, you don't need to put any of that in a report. I do, Mr. Morrow. Because the Coalition Council needs to understand something that I did not understand until today. There are 4,209 people in this settlement. We sent our distress beam to the Coalition. We aimed it at the 7th Patrol. We called our own people. And the first vessel to reach us, the only vessel to reach us before our water ran out, was a ship that was never supposed to hear us, crewed by one man who had every reason to keep flying, and who chose not to. She turned and walked back toward the settlement, leaving Cade sitting on the hard ground with his canteen, and the sound of water flowing through a processor that was held together with cargo adhesive and stubbornness. He sat there for a while. Then he stood up, put the canteen away, and walked back to the processor building, because the Stage 2 patch needed to be checked again in 2 hours, and he wanted to reinforce the mesh joints before the overnight temperature drop added thermal stress to the already marginal seal. The overnight temperature drop was worse than the environmental data had suggested. By midnight, the ambient had fallen to 3 degrees above freezing, and the processor housing, heated from the inside by the flowing water, cold from the outside by the desert air, was experiencing thermal gradients that the polymer patch had never been designed to handle. Cade checked the patch at the 2-hour mark and found the adhesive gasket separating at one corner. He resealed it, added a second layer of sealant compound, and bolted a strip of thermal insulation over the exterior surface to reduce the gradient. At the 4-hour mark, he checked again. The insulation was helping. The gasket was holding. The water flow was steady at 49% down from 52, but still within the viable range. At the 6-hour mark, an aftershock hit. It was small, a fraction of the original tremor's intensity, but it jolted the processor housing on its cracked foundation and sent a visible shudder through the Stage 2 patch. One of the mechanical fasteners popped loose. Water sprayed from the gap in a thin stream that hissed against the cold floor. Cade was on it in seconds, wrench in hand, tightening the loose fastener while Dren held a rag against the spray to keep the cadmium-laden water from reaching the clean output tank. The fastener seated. The spray stopped. Cade replaced the popped fastener with a larger one from his depleting supply, drilled a fresh hole next to the compromised one, and double-bolted the section. How many fasteners do you have left? Vane asked. Cade checked his count. Enough for 2 more repairs like that. After that, we're improvising with wire. Wire will not hold rated pressure. Wire doesn't need to hold rated pressure. It needs to hold 49% for another 8 hours. Vane considered this. You have been awake for approximately 26 hours. I'll sleep when your patrol gets here. She poured him a cup of something from a thermal flask, a Rithani drink, warm, faintly bitter with a taste that reminded Cade of chicory and iron filings. He drank it. It was not coffee. It was not terrible. Thank you, he said. Dren has been building a cross-reference database for human biochemistry since you arrived. He says it is the most interesting research project he has had in 3 years. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And Cade Morrow was not the kind of man who stopped working because someone told him he didn't have to be here. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't planned for it. He had been a cargo hauler on a routine transit, doing a job that paid just enough to keep his ship running and his licenses current, and he had heard a sound in the dark that was meant for someone else. He had gone toward it, that was all. There was nothing more to it than that. In the processor building, Dren was monitoring the settling tank, adjusting the coagulant mixture based on each batch's mineral assay. Vane was running a continuous diagnostic on the Stage 4 output. 2 Rithani volunteers were stacking filled water containers for distribution. The building smelled like polymer adhesive and wet rock. Cade picked up his welding unit and knelt beside the Stage 2 patch. Morrow, Vane said without looking up from her diagnostic panel. How long are you staying? Until your patrol gets here, he said, or until this patch gives out, whichever comes first. And if it gives out, then we patch it again. She looked at him then. Her expression was something he would think about later, when he was back on the Arden Mule running behind schedule toward Port Aveline with 60 tons less cargo and 2 blown regulator coils, and a docking penalty he couldn't afford, and a story he would never tell well because the important parts of it were just work, just hands and tools, and the decision to turn the ship. You are a strange species, Vane said. Cade lined up the welding tip on the first mesh joint and triggered the arc. We get that a lot. Dawn came slowly on PV 4418II, a pale gold line along the eastern horizon that widened into a wash of amber and rose across the desert. Cade watched it through the processor building's narrow window while Dren adjusted the coagulant batch for the morning run. The air outside was still cold, and the thermal insulation panels that Team 3 had distributed to the residential sectors during the night had kept the temperature in the affected buildings above the danger threshold, though several families had chosen to sleep in the central plaza near the generator-heated community hall instead. The colony was still standing, the water was still flowing, the patch was still holding. Cade allowed himself to feel, for the first time in 28 hours, something that was not urgency. It was not relief. Relief was for when the proper help arrived. It was something quieter. It was the feeling of having done what he could with what he had and not having failed yet. The Dorvathy 7th Patrol arrived 8 hours later, 16 hours after their departure from Anchor Point Texel. 2 frigates, a medical cruiser, and an engineering tender, coming in fast and hot with full communications capability and proper equipment, and 400 personnel trained for exactly this kind of response. Subcommander Koss transmitted his formal report, which included both his official objection to Cade's unauthorized presence and an addendum, filed separately under a personal attestation code, acknowledging that the 31 colonists recovered from the underground storage complex would not have survived the remaining time without external intervention. Cade Morrow watched the coalition ships settle onto the repaired landing platform. His Team 3 had patched the platform too, using the last of the reinforcement mesh from the processor building doorway. Vane stood beside him, Neither of them spoke for a while. The Dorvathy engineering team was already deploying from the tender, carrying prefabricated filtration modules, portable desalination units, and the kind of equipment that Cade had been improvising around for the past 22 hours. He watched them unload and felt something loosen in his chest. The tension of knowing that the patch could fail at any moment, and there was no backup plan except to patch it again. "Your work will hold until they replace the stages," Vane said, watching the engineers approach. "You know that." "I hoped it would. I didn't know it would." "There is a difference." "There's always a difference." She extended her hand. It was the first time a Rithani had made that gesture to him, and he realized she must have learned it from watching him offer his hand to Cass hours ago. He took it. Her grip was firm, her palm cool and dry, and the handshake lasted exactly the right amount of time. "Adequate response," she said. There was something in her voice that might have been humor or might have been something else. Then he walked 3 kilometers back across the Tesseract basin to his ship. The Arden Mule's transit drive fired up without complaint. The regulator coils held together for the first hour of transit, and then one of them gave out, which reduced his maximum speed by 15% and added another 4 hours to the Port Aveline leg. He arrived at Port Aveline 41 hours late. The docking penalty was significant. The Shipping Guild's cargo integrity officer, a meticulous woman named Greer who had processed Cade's manifests 41 times before and had never found a discrepancy, spent 90 minutes reviewing the manifest shortfall. 60 tons of consigned material, used without authorization, at a destination that didn't appear in any Shipping Guild route database. "You're telling me you used 60 tons of Harkin Constructions polymer and adhesive to patch a water processor on a planet we don't have in our catalog, for a species we have no commercial relationship with, because you heard a signal that wasn't aimed at you," Greer said, reading his preliminary report with an expression that Cade would later describe as professionally appalled. "That's correct. The client is going to file a complaint. I expect they will. The Guild will open an inquiry. I expect that too." Greer set the report down and looked at him over the top of her reading glasses. She had been a cargo integrity officer for 22 years, and she had seen every kind of manifest discrepancy from simple miscounts to deliberate fraud. She had never seen one that involved alien water purification. "The inquiry is going to ask why you didn't continue your transit and let Fleet Signals handle the response," she said. "Fleet Signals was 18 hours from receiving my report. The Dorvathy patrol was 18 hours out at best. The colony had 72 hours of water. I was 4 hours away." The math spoke for itself. Greer looked at him for a moment longer. Then she stamped the inquiry notice, filed the manifest discrepancy under the formal investigation code, and added a handwritten annotation to the bottom of the form that Cade didn't see until the inquiry board showed it to him 3 weeks later. It read, "Operator prioritized human life over commercial obligation. This office recommends the inquiry be resolved in the operator's favor." Cade filed his own detailed report, the intercept log, the signal analysis, the metadata from the Rithani beacon, and an accounting of every kilogram of cargo material used and its specific application. He filed it with the Merchant Marine Auxiliary, with Fleet Signals, with the Shipping Guild, and with the Human Diplomatic Liaison Office that handled coalition sector affairs. The report was 7 pages long. It contained no adjectives. It described what he had found, what he had done, and why he had done it in the same flat language he used for cargo manifests and maintenance logs. 3 weeks later, the Coalition Council's formal response arrived at the Human Diplomatic Liaison Office. It included a reimbursement authorization for the full value of the 60 tons of cargo, a waiver of all transit violations filed by Subcommander Cass, and a request phrased in the coalition's characteristically formal legal register, that the human government provide the technical specifications for the Arden Mules passive receiver array. Because the coalition wished to understand how a civilian cargo vessel had detected a sidelobe emission that their own relay architecture had been designed to contain. The diplomatic liaison forwarded the request to Fleet Signals with a one-line annotation. They want to know how we heard them. Fleet Signals forwarded the technical specifications. Attached was a note from the Signals officer who processed the file. Standard civilian receiver. Nothing special about the hardware. The operator made the decision. The Coalition Council studied the specifications for 3 months. They found what the Signals officer had found. The Arden Mules passive array was a stock civilian unit, manufactured in bulk, available from any licensed electronics supplier in human space. It had no special sensitivity, no exotic filtering capability, no classified technology. It simply listened on the Brannock Accord's frequency bands, checked incoming signals against the universal distress profile, and flagged matches for the operator's attention. The specifications did not explain why the operator had responded. The coalition's formal analysis acknowledged this gap. Their final report to the human diplomatic liaison included a paragraph that, stripped of the coalition's characteristically formal legal register, said, "The technology is unremarkable. The decision was not." 6 months after the incident, the Shipping Guild's inquiry was resolved in Cade's favor, citing the Brannock Accord's emergency response provision for civilian vessels and Greer's handwritten annotation. The Guild also updated its training materials. Cade Morrow was already on his next haul when the reimbursement came through. He used part of it to replace the regulator coils and part of it to properly rebuild the No. 3 cargo clamp. The rest went into the Arden Mules operating fund. He never visited PV 4418 again. He never met a Rathani again. He thought about Vane sometimes, and about Dren's settling tank, and about the girl who had walked out of the collapsed tunnel holding a water container she hadn't drunk from because there were littler ones who needed it more. He didn't think about it as heroism. He thought about it as what you do when you hear someone calling for help, and you have a ship and a cargo bay full of materials and no good reason not to turn. Every ship on the Palav Shoals route now picks up the same set of Brannock Accord's frequencies. Most of them will never hear anything but static. But the receivers are on, and the protocols are running, and somewhere in the Shipping Guild's training materials there is now a case study, filed under emergency response, civilian operators, cross-species, that describes what happened when one hauler caught a sidelobe that was never meant for him, and decided that the math of margin and docking penalties was less important than the math of water and hours and lives. The case study does not use the word hero. It uses the phrase adequate response. Cade would have approved of that.